I'm recording.
Can you hear me
Right.
now?
Yes.
Great. Yes, it does.
Yeah, I'll do
Excuse me, my crayon is a monkey, which I find this conversation
Taking some interest in learning a bit more about technology, philosophy, and I like to.
I'm an educator.
Absolutely.
We're gonna stay anonymous.
That's a cop out.
The binary's gone. I thought jingle was plus Dutch for cheers.
Hi, peeps. Welcome to Beyond Binary Thinking, where we talk about some difficult issues, some interesting topics, and try and shed a bit of light and nuance where it's much needed. Today, we are blessed to be joined by a very interesting YouTuber who the algorithm was lovely enough to suggest to me. Saint Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. Nice to be here.
Thank you for being there.
Yeah, if you could please sort of introduce yourself, where you're from, what you're about, and what your YouTube channel does. That'd be lovely.
Well, my name is Andrew, or Saint Andrew. I am an Afro-Trinidadian YouTuber and writer. I tend to cover topics related to colonialism, ecology, and as well as general anarchist organization and philosophy.
Nice.
Yeah, big fan. We will, as always, have the links in the show notes at the bottom. But yeah, really appreciated your videos and reached out. Thought it'd be lovely to have a chat really about all of the above and go off on any tangent that comes up as we go along.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, as we can represent the former colonial powers, former, current.
You say current, but let's start there. So I'm British, so the only really bit of colonialism we learned is just how big and brilliant Britain was, how colonialism and slavery ended, and how lovely the British were.
Thanks to the
helping that transition.
Thanks to the great empathy and moral uprightness of the British Empire. So
Exactly. Yeah.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
The white man
I'm
saved us all.
forever. I'm forever in your debt.
Yeah.
No, we'll call it even after this podcast. So,
Should I say Chris or Christopher Columbus?
Well, I'm also, my surname is Cook, so yeah, I'm just gonna.
Oh boy, colonize on colonize.
All the good names. So, yeah, let's start there then. Everything that's wrong with my education about the British Empire and colonialism.
I mean, that's a good opening. Honestly, I guess the first thing I would address is that the British didn't end slavery because it was the right thing to do. The abolitionist movement was going on for a while. The reason they ended was because it was no longer as profitable for them.
As usual.
And they still managed to find ways to extract, even after they ended slavery. They shuffled people around, they rebranded in a few different ways with, indentured servitude and all these different things, moving people across the world either way, and continue to extract from their colonies, even up to and post-independence. As many people know, there was a wave of independence movements throughout the 20th century, where a lot of colonial holdings, not just British but otherwise, were released from their hands either by force or by referendum. And even despite that, a lot of them are still part of the Commonwealth, and a lot of these former colonial holdings still have extremely strong ties and influence and are heavily influenced by the British Empire. So, of course, we still have, specific to Trinidad, and I'm sure it's the case I believe it's the case in most other former colonial holdings, our laws were still heavily based on the British legal codes, and they are just as archaic. In fact, only a couple of years ago did we finally overturn some very ancient buggery laws that were introduced by the British, exporting homophobia since well, hundreds of years now, really. Um, and that's just one example. We still have faced those consequences. It wasn't just that boom, independence and we free. There was still lasting consequences, and it's not even enough that there were lasting consequences. They are still acting in ways to further colonialism today and the colonial project today, just in a new sort of globalized context, whether it be through the exploitation of cheap labor or the expropriation of land and extraction of land and resources. These deals that they have with various global south politicians. And yeah, I guess that's a good introduction, really. There are still serious ties and still serious colonial practices that are taking place today.
I think you're understating that.
It's a
To be
brilliant
honest,
introduction, by the
well,
way.
it is, but I think you're quite understating it when you say there's some influence. I think if there
Oh,
was
yeah, yeah.
if there was any one thing that happened in human history, colonialism, European colonialism influenced the global world in irreparable ways. It's dominated a large
Yeah.
part of the world that still we see a lot of effects of. The
I guess I was
times
just
that
being
happened.
a bit cheeky with my choice of wording.
Yeah, for sure. But then let me be at least the
Yeah,
one
I mean,
to admit that there's the impact has been enormous, right? It's
truly. There isn't really any part of the world that you can go that hasn't been touched by
exactly.
European
Not
colonialism.
a single native culture that hasn't been affected by European colonialism. It's insane.
Yeah, even the so-called uncontacted are still,
Yeah,
heavily impacted by
yeah,
the activities in the surrounding regions, whether it be
yeah.
in the Amazon or in the case of that nation that exists on that island in the Indian Ocean. They're still very heavily affected by the activities and goings on around them.
hmm Yeah, exactly. But how to find a way out? Like how to find a way forward, maybe not out, but forward. Like we have the situation that we have. I think you've made some suggestions in your videos as well.
Yeah, I think I think it would be naive to assume that the European powers would ever willingly repay the costs of their activities across the world. And in fact, I don't think it would be possible for them to repay,
Well,
considering
fully
the
no. Yeah,
hundreds of millions of
yeah,
lives that have been, well, billions of lives that have been impacted by their activities. I don't think there's a
yeah.
way for it to be like, well, here's a check, reparations over. I think it's a complicated topic, and it's still something that I'm grappling with and researching today. But I think that there isn't a way out that doesn't involve the complete dismantlement of those nation states.
Right.
Yeah, I think therein lies the rub.
Yeah, nation states. Yeah.
And I was overwhelmed watching some of your videos, and then, as I often do, scraping the barrel with the right-wing objections to any of these movements, is how thoughtful, nuanced, and respectful to opposing differing views someone such as yourself is. Whereas the other side will just spin it. So it's too complex. I would never be able to do anything. And like for you, would never be able to do anything. It's like, oh, but it'd be really complex, and it's this fighting against all these powerful structures. But for them, it's just a way of stalling, and that's why I loved just simply.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the main activities,
back,
right?
Land back. There you go.
Yeah, it's
And when
simple.
you
It's
said,
to the point.
reparations, like, it'd be tricky. I think there's so many talking heads making so many column inches, making so much noise. But the thing that really broke my heart reading into this is how much money was given in reparations to former slave owners.
Yeah.
Right? So the idea that it's impossible.
Any any efforts, any movements were silenced, were suppressed by actually oppressed people to receive reparations. And that's really the strategy, they stole, they hem, they whore, whatever the case may be. They, of course, give resources and support to the oppressors, but the oppressed get nothing. And after maybe a couple decades of stalling, they can say, oh, well, it's too late, that's in the past, move on.
Well, I think don't be fooled in activity and start maybe with at least the discussions around the small things. I think UK is maybe a bit behind. I think Holland has a lot to do still to recover from or make up from the past. But at least the discussion here, for example, has started around museum artifacts.
Oh yes,
And
that's a topic I'm pretty passionate about.
yeah, right. So we need to give back a lot of the stuff we took from colonial territories that we display here, which belong somewhere else. But the discussions are at least starting here. We're not at the point that we're giving everything back yet. It's gonna take time.
I
Unfortunately,
mean, some of these artifacts that are sitting down collecting dust in these museums have like significant spiritual and cultural significance to still existing cultures today.
Yeah.
And it's like if somebody walked into your house, stole your grandmother's urn,
exactly. Yeah,
kept it in their house
put
for
it into
decades.
a glass display case here, and it's a bit bizarre, even if you have the right perspective to walk around there and look at it.
Oh, James
It's like a
Acaster does
graveyard.
a beautiful bit where he breaks us down, and he's like, you can literally walk into a museum and someone be like, "Oh, excuse me, that's my stuff." How do you know?
Yeah.
Says on the label in front of the display. It says where you got it from.
Yeah, I've read stories of of various indigenous cultures and people from indigenous cultures coming to a museum and recognizing the handicraft of their neighbors or their ancestors, because there are nuances to it, and there are like little details that they can tell who did what, and to have like your heritage sitting down, profiting a colonial holdover, it's disheartening. I mean, I joke that I plan on coming to Europe specifically to expropriate the artifacts, but it's just a joke. Cough, cough.
Yeah, I haven't
It will
heard-
be a long, complicated process. I think, unfortunately, in reality, I think
I haven't heard any
too
good
much
argument
resistance
now.
now.
Like, has anyone heard any good argument for why they belong in a museum? And it was really funny because I was sort of used to it. I've raised up on it. School trips, you just become like most things in school. I've learned to abhor nature because it just reminds me of long walks in the countryside I was dragged to unwillingly as a child, right? and museums were the same, right? You'd walk around and there's some Egyptian shit, and you're like, whatever. And it was only because I spent 8 years in Thailand, and I realized how precious they are to the idea of symbols of Buddha being exported, right? Like how sacred they are, how they must remain in temples. And I was walking around the British Museum and saw, a bunch of Egyptian stuff, and was like, yeah, that's what you see, Egyptian stuff in museums. I've seen that in France and whatever. And I walked around the corner and just saw all these Buddha heads that had clearly just been sledgehammered out of temples from Asia. And it was only then did it hit me that, oh my God, we are the fucking barbarians. Just raiding places.
Grave robbing and stealing.
I mean, imagine if it was the other way around and in China there were just a bunch of crosses they'd stolen from European cathedrals. What our response to that would be.
Yeah, imagine if they just like pulled up to some cathedrals and sought out some stained glass art,
Well, sure, and that is the most obvious example. But even the situations where Europeans came with their ships and they were handed for free, or maybe even gave money in the best situation, which probably didn't happen much, traded a little bit for it. But they were giving a lot of the objects because they were a force of power, right? They were seen as a huge dominant force of power, carrying ships and cannons, and we got it in a way that wasn't really fair, right? It's if someone intimidates you on the street and you give something to them, it's not really a fair way of giving it to the person. Yeah. You gotta feel it's stolen, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're flashing your gun around and you're like, oh, can I have this? You know,
Yeah.
it's still a threat, you know,
Exactly.
implicit or explicit.
But that's hard. Like, I honestly, I've been amazed by the backlash I face when discussing this, because really the standard response from people in Britain is like, why do you hate Britain? Why are you so anti-Britain, anti the empire? Like just raising
I mean,
things
why
that people
aren't you?
sensitive. Yeah.
And I guess it ties back to the education thing, but like, Jesus.
Well, the UK kind of withdrew very much into their empire idea with Brexit, especially. We're still a dominant global power, and we're proud of what our past has done. And I think there's other countries that look at their past maybe a little bit more critically. I think Germany has looked at their recent past a little bit more critically. I think the Netherlands had looked at their past very bit critically as well. And maybe all not enough, but it's better than maybe France and the UK, which still I think are
still
active colonial powers.
Coasting on World War II vibes, right? We're like, yeah, we're the goodies.
Yeah,
still the goodies.
The good guys, supposedly, yeah. I mean, meanwhile, you know, you have France still holding on to islands in the Pacific.
An enormous amount of territory. Enormous.
Yes, like,
I was looking it up and I was surprised how many colonies you still have. Wow.
And there's some interesting laws. There's not quite apartheid, but there's a definite two-tier system with French colonial law. It's interesting.
Oh, yeah, and they try to obscure it because there was a podcast I was listening to recently about, I can't remember the name right now, but they were talking about how the French government, I believe it's illegal to, in their censuses, mention or account for race. So they're like massive discrepancies in terms of income and opportunity that just kind of painted over with French nationalism, you know.
Yes,
we're
there was
all
an
French
interesting moment when Trevor Noah talked about the football team, and the French are really against the idea of like African American, right? As they call it, like double-barreled French citizens. They're like, no, we are all French, and it comes across very égalité, fraternité. But
yeah, until you remember that the
let's not
French
talk about race. Let's not mention it.
Yeah, and on top of that, it's until you remember that the French were shouting égalité, fraternité, liberté, égalité, fraternité, but the people who were fighting for that were also fighting, you know, to keep their colonial holdings, you know.
Right.
They were French capitalists rising up against the French aristocracy. If you really go back into the history.
So I was taught growing up that the Spanish were evil pillagers, right? Like if you look at their empire, they would just go to a place, fuck it up, extract as much mineral resource as possible. The Dutch were clever traders, and they built their empire through mutually beneficial trading deals. And the British, well, we gave people laws and civilization and railroads. And even, I think, like, Jeremy Paxman, like, less than 10 years ago, did a documentary where he went around India asking people, but aren't you grateful for the trains?
I think I'll be more grateful for the, you know, millions not dying due to famine, you know.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I think that's another colonial assumption that tends to, I suppose, permeate, well, not even, like, all sorts of spaces, really. It's the assumption that that colonialism was ultimately a net benefit for the people who were colonized. It's like, if people who acknowledge the bad, it's like, yeah, sure, you know, people died due to massacres and famines and families were split up, but, you know, technological advancement and the advancement of humanity or whatever makes up for it. And it's like, does it though?
Well, that's a similar idea, I think, of the American colonization, the more modern colonization, right? America spreading their cultural good across the world, occupying territory with military bases for the advancement of global society. And I do think as well here in the Netherlands, people just don't realize where their where their massive income comes from and why the Netherlands is one of the richest places in the entire world. Sure, there's some recent developments that we involved ourselves with global trade. But before that, we got, we built our empire based on the backs of the rest of the world. And then you get people here that with Corona, their businesses are shut down temporarily. And they're like, the government, they're giving money to the outside world. And where is our money? And I don't think they're realizing how many people are starving due to the fact that we once sailed out with our boats with cannons and influenced the path of the rest of the world.
Exactly.
And took all the riches out of literally the backs of people laboring for us.
It's like, there's this image that goes around sometimes, There's this guy who climbs on top of a bunch of people to get to the very top, and then he's like, I got here all my own. It's sort of a blindness to the experiences of other people.
Well, it still happens with Mount Everest, right? How many Sherpas are carrying everything up and down, exploring the paths on their own. And then the rich white man gets to climb to the top with the help of everyone else to get their picture and their achievement. And
it's true, right? Yeah, for every Instagram selfie of a rich white man on at the top of Everest, there's the Sherpa that does it 3 times a week. Right?
Exactly, yeah.
Exactly.
Carrying his stuff, yeah, fuck.
And quite a few of them, their bodies are still on the mountain,
So I think to drive this conversation forward, then I'm going to have to play the annoying devil's advocate that you two can beat up with a stick.
Sure. Happy to.
Are you happy too? Would that be fun?
100%. I'll just pretend you are Christopher Columbus,
Yes. I'll channel the spirit of Captain Cook and Christopher Columbus, my ancestors. I mean, I think a big part of my problem with this narrative, right, is that isn't history the sum of a bunch of people shitting on each other? Like, if it wasn't for the Europeans doing that at that point, can we not look further back and see that entirety of history is just a bunch of people being mean to one another?
Well, sure, Chris. Okay, well, I'll give Andrew a chance, but it's just something that's been thinking on my mind, right? Like the fact that, for example, Mongolia and Genghis Khan once dominated Europe, right? The exact territory that we are in right now. But how much of that are you currently noticing within your actual real life?
Precisely.
The fact that once happened, you're not noticing it at all. But
I would
colonial
argue,
dominant, people still notice it in their day-to-day life.
I would argue that the Europeans' desire to go forward and conquer the earth is because we have the genes of Genghis Khan and the Romans in us combined, the same as everyone else does on this earth. Everyone that's survived however many generations has been conquered at some point by someone and inherited some of those aggressive genes.
I would say it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility to understand the cause and effect.
And I didn't address your point. I do understand your point that right now I don't feel that Genghis Khan owes me reparations. That is a different topic.
Yeah, I there's a lot to respond to here, but I think I'll start with like Mirin was saying, the impact of European colonization has touched every corner of the globe, and its consequences are still being felt today. Its activity is still ongoing today. And I mean, you can point to the actions of ancient empires, and those are obviously things that we wholly condemn. I mean, Genghis Khan was out here descending on people, kidnapping and splitting up families, killing people. But it's because it's something that we feel today that we focus on it. And I reject the idea that, we all have that conquering in our DNA, because I think I try not to fall into the realm of, essentialism. I think that we all ultimately have a choice, because for every conqueror, there were thousands of nurturing, parents and kin that were resisting being conquered, that we're caring for each other. I think for every instance of competitiveness and violence and war and conquest, there are many more examples of cooperation and mutual aid and, care.
Yeah.
So I think we shouldn't lose sight of that.
I really like that perspective when I see your YouTube videos as well.
Thank you.
The fact that you're looking for the connection and the nurturing people and the ones that want to take care of each other and the world around them and the system that they live in, make it a little bit better. Yeah. I really appreciate that when I see that message in your videos.
Yeah, I mean, if the Europeans did not colonize the rest of the world, I mean, that is a massive thought experiment to undertake, I would say that, I mean, who's to say where we would be at, perhaps scientifically speaking or technologically speaking, because there were practices that the Europeans ended up erasing, when they erased, and knowledges they ended up erasing when they did colonize. So who knows where these different cultures that were erased and suppressed and destroyed could have gone in the future. That's hard to speculate on, but
It'd be an interesting
I
world.
guess it's,
Yeah.
to tie it into ecology a bit, which is something I'm very passionate about. I don't think we would be where we're at in terms of facing an existential climate crisis.
Well, I think for sure, because very literally, the current capitalist system was an inheritance of the colonial empire. In the way labor was turned into capital, and the way labor was turned into capital from the colonial empire became then machine labor, and machine labor then drove the industrial revolution.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm grateful for the decrease in infant mortality, and
right.
The advancements in medicine, and the fact that I could call up somebody. I could call you guys actually, and I'm in Trinidad. Marin is in the Netherlands. It's Netherlands, right?
Yeah, Netherlands. Yeah.
Right, and Chris is in the UK, and we're able to contact you all despite our geographic boundaries. But it's also a question of at what cost, because a couple of decades from now, in fact, a few decades from now, I would be surprised if the land where I'm living right now is underwater,
Yeah. If people can still call each other the way we are calling each other right now.
Yeah, I mean, there was this acceleration in technological advancement, but it's at what cost, Millions of lives, thousands of cultures, languages, rituals, species, just gone,
Yeah. Well, an interesting thing, I think, and this is also a topic for another episode, but I've been recently doing a lot of quantum mechanics, watching a lot of videos about it. And so Europeans are very good at measuring. We spent a lot of money at measuring in science. And we've measured very tiny things in the universe. And then we've come to the most ridiculous, weird theories that correspond maybe a bit as well with ancient philosophies. And did we need to do all that measuring? Could we maybe, instead of have done all that measuring and trade and everything else, maybe organize society in a different way? So yeah, for sure, if the Europeans had never colonized the world, it would be interesting, right?
That's a false dichotomy if I ever heard one.
Why?
I nerds are gonna nerd. It's fine for someone to.
But are we progressing necessarily society or even our knowledge with it?
Yes, categorically, the advances in science and medicine, the speed with which the COVID vaccine
it always comes down to medicine, though.
Phenomenal.
Medicine is the one thing that no one dares to argue against.
Well, no, and engineering. I mean,
but of course, the medicine conversation has nuance to it as well, because you also have to consider the amount of diseases that have sprung up because of industry and the the concentration of humans and our expansion into natural environments and factory
and our
farming
reliance
and
on industrial meat. Yes,
yeah,
yeah, for sure. But
unhealthy lifestyles, 8-hour workdays, all that
sure.
to it as well.
Before we get too anti-scientific here, I think you don't need to tie together, right? Like colonialism, capitalism, and science, and I don't think it's productive to do so. Let me just disentangle those things. I liked everything else I heard, but at that point, I'm like, I don't think.
I mean,
because I've heard this
I don't think
argument,
it's-
the idea that modern education, modern scientific education, is part of that colonial doctrination, right? Have you heard this?
I mean,
Maths is racist.
to some
And
extent,
for me, it's
some
an
extent.
example of just taking it too far. Because the next
Well-
generation of solar panels are going to be made by scientists, right? Like,
I mean, to some
and I wish
extent,
there were more
you have to
people
consider.
of color and people from other countries involved and given opportunities in those
But
sciences.
but Chris,
But I'm not against science.
Western education, and okay, maybe not the hardcore science, but Western education, I think it's Europe and the people without history.
Yeah, and
it's
to
it's the
talk
perspective of
specifically
Europe.
about science, right? To get back to that point, I think you might be ignoring the fact that basically every scientific field does have like a colonial legacy that it needs to grapple with, from medical science to archaeology to anthropology. A lot of these scientific fields have a serious racist history that modern practitioners are now coming to terms with, and that we're still facing the consequences of today.
Well, and I can talk for anthropology, which I studied. That definitely they came to terms with that. There's a huge, very introspective approach to anthropology and the past of the domain, especially in the early 20th century.
Yeah, most of Western academia is the study of white celebrities of the last 200 years, right?
Yeah. And medically, we did get a lot of ingredients from native tribes' knowledge of their plants.
Yeah, those contributions and erased. Same with the black slaves of colonial doctors and whatnot. They often provided a lot of innovations and stuff, but they were never credited for them.
Yeah,
Because
isn't
the
that where
knowledge that they
vaccines
had.
come from, right?
Yeah, vaccinations, C-sections, different birthing techniques as well. I mean, it's something a lot of people forget because, we have pharmaceuticals these days, but there's a lot of herbal knowledge, and I'm not trying to get into, ooga booga, mysticism or anything.
Well, but even the
But
fact that you
there
have
are
to
a lot
make
of
that
plants and herbs that-
precursory apology is telling, right? Like, it
Yeah.
shows the problem with the conversation.
Yeah, European would never have to do that.
Yeah, because there are knowledges that have been, so significantly disrespected because there are aspects of them that have been reappropriated and, like if you look at the the New Age movement, they often took from practices and cultures and basically colonized them, and now they have those knowledges have a certain connotation these days, but there are a lot of plants and a lot of herbs and there are a lot of mixtures and whatnot that do have serious medicinal benefits that are now being understood, that were understood in the past, but those knowledges were erased and had to be rediscovered.
Well, there's I think a lot of knowledge from more native cultures about how to live in harmony with the system around them.
Yeah.
Both socially as well as environmentally. And I think that's where a lot of the influence of Europe kind of fucked up society. It alienated people from social
that
structures and
Christian-
from environmental structures.
It's that Christian notion of dominating the earth, you know.
They got stuck in the dominating vibe.
Sorry?
So Europeans got stuck in the dominating
Mentality.
vibe. Yeah. Still noticeable today, right? You want to win. You want to get richer. You want to, be better
Rule
than
the
others. Yeah.
So how does reparations fit into that narrative? Because, I don't see, number one, the massive backlash of repaying billions. And I don't think many of the governments who you'd repay billions to are particularly famous for being environmental, collaborative. They probably have their own dominance hierarchies, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's another export, right? The whole parliamentary system and whatnot that is not representative of the people. I think it would be unwise to try to achieve reparations through governments or through, policies or reforms or that sort of thing. I think the best effort for reparations would have to come from the grassroots. It would have to come from a complete upheaval of the entire global system. It's not something that can be done overnight. It's something that can be done over a few years. It's going to take a lot of time, but we can't approach this under the assumption that it's something that these governments will ever be happy with,
Yeah. I think it needs to, I think you say it in the video as well, it needs the destruction of capitalism and the nationalistic idea of organizing society.
It's something I grapple with. Can there really be reparations while there are still, borders that exist that divide and enclose and separate? And I really don't think there can be.
Yeah, because I was thinking about the Amazon. How are you going to give native tribes their land back when, first of all, it's divided into multiple nation states, each with their own IDs? And then even if you give that territory, how are you going to protect the tribes against farmers that cut down the Amazon anyway and come there with guns?
Those incentives still exist for them to do that in the first place. Exactly.
Yeah, and let's not
You have
have
to remove the
benevolent.
whole incentive structure.
You need to have a benevolent nation state, which,
Yeah.
Brazil, for example, is not.
But what we can't have is benevolent racism and this colonial idea of noble savagery, right? Where if we gave a bunch of Amazon tribes loads of money, they wouldn't just buy a bunch of chainsaws and sell the wood themselves, which in many cases
we're not
would
really
probably
seeing.
happen.
No,
No,
I disagree. I disagree.
I think we
That's
hold
not
up
the stories that you're reading from people that are researching that territory. It's mostly done by force. And mostly a lot of native people are killed in raids by farmers.
Resisting and fighting against, that expansion.
I have very, very rarely heard any research being done that says that actually the native tribes are selling their own territory. And we're not talking about giving money to them. We're at least talking about letting them hang on to their territory, which is the Amazon forest, which is the lungs of the earth, which if, there's one lost place we should at least be respecting, it's that. But then, it's under the control of Bolsonaro, and we don't have an international nation-state structure where we can even influence that territory. So we need the complete destruction of the system. If we have those borders, if we have Bolsonaro in power of that piece of territory because there's a line drawn there.
And if we still have those incentives in place where people want to do this expansion into that land, for profit.
Yeah,
but as long as the profit incentive exists, this problem can never really be solved.
Yeah,
But
and the profit incentive comes from colonialism, Chris. It was the driver of colonialism. This profit incentive, this making surplus, this getting more out of labor than you put into labor.
Gents,
it exploded there.
I'll give you a chance, but for now, just let me say that the reason why the Amazon rainforest is being encroached on is because the three of us enjoy drinking coffee, right?
Oh, I don't drink coffee.
Okay.
Well, not necessarily, Chris. It's soybeans grown for meat.
For me. Okay.
Yeah.
so I think it's very easy to extrapolate on such a large abstract scale that we talk about 200-year-old white men doing things, but simply put, like we all enjoy the products made from the destruction of the Amazon rainforest in one way or another, right? And we live in a society.
I mean, that just ties into no ethical consumption under capitalism, which kind of goes back to the point of dismantling the system.
Yeah,
and
but
the profit
yeah,
incentive.
we would all agree that it can't be pinned to individuals, right? Because that clearly doesn't work. Like, I think over the last year during the pandemic, we've all probably lived our most environmentally friendly lives physically possible. Like, none of us are flying on private jets around the world.
Well, the private jets are still flying, I think.
Oh yeah, they are. And yet it's still not enough, right? Like, there's 8 corporations doing it all. And I think that's where it gets conflated. And that's where I worry, is that are we talking about crimes 100 years ago when we should be talking about crimes now? Are the main perpetrators right now corporations instead of nation states?
It's really a mix of both, right? Because these governments have deals with international conglomerates.
Exactly.
It's a collaboration with the state and capital, which
As
historically is what the state has to,
This is Western neoliberalism, right? This is...
Yeah, even pre-neoliberalism, this was going on, so...
So how do we fight against the defensive backlash? Because a lot of everything that's just been described tells me that, and this is the funny thing that the boomers say, right? Like the boomer conservative Brexit voters say that all of these arguments are anti-British, anti-white, anti-me, anti-my society, anti-my economic structure. They want to tear apart everything, which I think is all right. How do you win votes and win hearts and win minds? And we talked about essentialism earlier. Like, how do we shift from these people are bad, right? White people are, to a conversation?
Yeah, I mean, you spoke about winning votes there, but you're never going to be able to vote for the system to destroy itself, right? So I wouldn't even be looking into that avenue.
That's true. You do have a 2-party state, both of which support all of the above.
Yeah.
You get a choice of color.
It's not an easy answer. It's not an answer that doesn't involve like serious upheaval. It's not an answer that doesn't involve violence. Because, they're not going to be like, okay, yeah, sure, go ahead. Dismantle us,
It's very hard to get people to vote for violence, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, they do fight for, they do vote for warmongers all the time, not so. It's just what violence and
violence.
I'm not sure when this episode is coming out, so my video might be out by then, but I have a magnum opus coming out on violence and non-violence at the end of this month, so you can look out for that one. But yeah, it's really about what violence are people comfortable with, because people tend to be comfortable with status violence, and it ties into education. You have to sort of open people's eyes to the structural violence that exists. You're not going to be able to get everybody, of course, because some people have class incentives or benefit from certain structures of privilege, particularly those in the global north. But it has to start somewhere, and it's not going to go away that soon.
I mean, hasn't this already been tried and failed though? Wasn't there a wave of socialist or communist countries in Africa in the, let's say, 70s? Because I don't know.
Yeah, it was between
post-colonial Britain, right? Like as the empire fell apart, most of those countries lent, let's say, left, for point of simplicity. Like, yeah. So
I
why
would
didn't
say
that
it
work, and
was
why will it work next time?
it was a mid 20th century phenomenon, and I think when I look at those movements, and I spoke about it briefly in my Pan Africanism introductory video. When you look at those movements and how they were organized, it was they were primarily nationalist in character, and they were the way they were structured. It still lent itself to a replication of the very same issues that they were fighting against. So they were fighting colonial domination, but they installed replications really of those same hierarchical government structures with the same incentive structures of domination and exploitation, just under perhaps a different coat of paint. I mean, of course, I don't want to generalize these movements because different movements had different characters. Some are better than others. Some had different goals, and some worked out very differently. And of course, they had a lot of external pressure to deal with. But fundamentally, when you look at their organization and how most of 20th century's movements were organized, it was still a very hierarchical, very top-down approach to the issue. You know, there were still rulers and ruled. There were still, exploiters and the exploited. The actual fundamental relations didn't change that much, because people do point to, oh well, socialism failed or whatever. When you actually look at the character of these systems and how they were organized, how they ran themselves. I mean, the USSR wasn't good for the environment either. They also, exploited territory and cleared forests and rapidly industrialized. And
Yeah, their tanks.
But they were pretty
colonized.
pretty good with equality of race and gender. And okay,
Yeah, I mean,
like
not to say
under
that-
Stalin, they all suffered, but they didn't make as much of a difference between race and gender as they did outside of communism. Quite honestly,
Except for Ukraine, who they let starve.
Yeah, there was still certain prejudices, particularly anti-Semitism and stuff, that did exist, and I don't want to paint it as, oh, it was all bad, because they definitely did make positive strides. But ultimately, when you take an analysis of how things were structured, it was still replicating certain patterns of domination. And I think, as Chris was asking, why do I think a new movement would be able to avoid that? I think it starts with learning from their mistakes and also looking at how we prevent the replication of those mistakes. I think it starts with of course, an intersectional outlook. It starts with an ecological outlook. It starts with, I think, a lot of localizing and grass and like bottom up rather than top down organizing, because as long as there are people on top and people below, the same issues will be replicated. The people themselves need to have the power to affect their own lives, to not be subject to the whims and motives and ideals of particular figures. They have to be empowered. They have to have the power in their own hands. And I think that is a step towards, an actually free society,
Mm-hmm. And why now, Chris?
A society
Because
not based on exploitation.
we have a great chance, because we are able to become very much intersectional and ecologically aware, because we have so much more information and connection with the outside world.
The internet has united us
It's changed.
far
Yeah,
beyond our national
Yeah.
identities.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's a perfect time right now. We know much more. And it's also much more critical right now for these things to happen.
Absolutely.
Can I thank you so much, Andrew, for turning me on to Franz Fanon? Just blown away by his thought.
Happy to.
Yeah, really, and I can't recommend Let's just everyone read it. I really think it should just be compulsory reading for any education ever.
Absolutely.
But just going through it, one of the main points I picked up from it was a couple of quotes which I thought were. Do you know that saying that like good science fiction gets better with time? Anyway, just some of his quotes just struck me so hard. The idea that the intellectual overstresses the details and they lose sight of the unity of the movement and they
Yeah.
end up lost to doubt and despair, and they forget what's important, the broad and inclusive positions of bread and land. And I think that spoke so strongly to the crisis that's happening in the
Yeah,
left
'cause
at the moment.
there are these assumptions, and they still exist today, and they definitely existed back then. And that kind of ties into the whole Leninist notion of the vanguard, right? That the masses are not capable of managing themselves, you know. And a lot of intellectuals, you know, they get so lost in the weeds of theory and, you know, this concept and that concept, theoretical concept, as if people have not been managing themselves for, you know, thousands of years. You know, as if people don't know where their interests lie. I mean, of course, it has been obscured by, you know, advertising and manufacturing consent and all these different things, but ultimately people do know, or they will come to an awareness of what it means to be free and what it means to manage their lives. I think intellectuals often lose that, but, you know.
I just was struck wondering whether the American Democratic National Party are the perfect example of what Fanon talks about with the urban bourgeoisie that just are incapable of caring about the rural poor.
Yeah, yeah. It rears its ugly head very often, you know, this notion of the stupid Hicks, you know.
Yeah, the reason people voted for Trump because they were abandoned by what used to be the party of the working class, right?
Yeah.
And so, is there a way out in our current political system? I know I keep asking this question in different ways, but how do you get the turkeys to vote for Thanksgiving? Like, how do you get people to vote? People in power to vote for the destruction of a system of power.
I mean, you don't. You give them no other choice, right?
Let them have guillotines.
Oh gosh. I actually have a video upcoming related to the guillotine. That should be releasing in April, so I have some thoughts to share on that. I will say though that looking at the history of the guillotine and the logic of the guillotine, I don't think that's the path either, you know. Not that I'm some pacifist, or not that I'm deluded into thinking they will willingly give up their power, but I think it replicates certain relationships to domination in the first place, you know.
Right, so it's sort of revenge, it's flipping the power.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, trust me, I have some very intense revenge fantasies, but you have to be able to separate your revenge fantasies from your politics. You have to
Which
be able
is-
to separate from your hurt from, you know, your activism.
I've always felt that this is a little bit the problem that Jews have a little bit in Israel, is that they turned the cheek of the Nazism a little bit too much themselves. Like they got influenced by that revenge idea, or like not even revenge, but
the
just so
Zionists.
scared, like damaged by it, that they just can't think outside of that kind of domination structure. And you either win or you lose. You either dominate or you get dominated. Which is
Yeah, I
not the
think
way out, right? The way out is to give up those power structures and to work towards cooperation and feeling also not that we're striving for a lack of resources, but seeing the abundance of resources that we have can be a flip of
Yeah.
perspective. Looking for connection rather than disconnection.
Agreed.
So much of this conversation has reminded me of sort of the core. Yeah, I'm exiting the straw man phase of this debate now. Like, so much of this reminds
God.
me of
Thank
my
God. Yeah, had me a bit
do
worried
it.
there for a
Yes,
second.
yeah, did a good job, Chris.
I wanted to do it, and I think
You
it
really played the character very well.
teased out some good points from you, so thank you
Yeah.
for that. But so much of it reminds me of just my days at university, where and it's lived with me forever. My central tenet is the idea of a draw, right? Like so much of society is dominated by the idea of winning and losing, and we're just all so much stronger and happier when you can draw. And I just hate the idea of zero-sum games where we're competing for scarce resources. Like everything about that is everything that's wrong with the world to me.
Yeah. I mean, and you also have to think about artificial scarcity as well, and the artificial scarcity that's created to raise prices and whatnot,
I mean, even the
and
idea of
to
homelessness.
delineate the haves from the
right?
have-nots.
Look at London, for example, where housing is unbelievable. I couldn't imagine. There might be somewhere more expensive on Earth, but there shouldn't be. I think even during a time in the world where more people left London than entered, right? You had the conditioning factors of no one was working in offices, so everyone fled London.
Right.
Because of Brexit, there was no immigration to London. So there was more empty flats than ever. And guess what happened to the prices of housing?
Went up.
Answer will surprise you. It went up. And then no one got paid to work. So you had, well, no, that's not true. A bunch of people got paid to work because our government isn't as bad as America's. But you only earned that if you had a job and a house, right? Like, so yeah, like artificial scarcity is just unbelievably painful, and it's an embarrassing plight on anyone that would defend the current system. I sometimes think like the basis of this podcast. I used to be the centrist devil's advocate, which now I have to pretend to be. I really do think that I'm not that ultra left wing. I'm just arguing that no one in a world of abundance should be starving or homeless. And apparently that puts me in the box of radical left wing.
Right.
So here I am.
Do you mind if I read a quote from the Grapes of Wrath that's, pretty related to this?
Please
do.
do. That'd be
Yeah.
a wonderful way to take us home. And look, we've got so much more to say, but I think end on an inspiring quote. And
It's not inspiring. It's
end on an
it's
depressing
depressing.
quote.
As well,
That's
yeah.
fine. And we'll have more to do for another episode tonight. I have loved it. Thank you so much.
Thank you as well. Let me begin. This is John Steinbeck of the Grapes of Wrath. The works of the roots, of the vines, of the trees must be destroyed to keep up the price. And this is the saddest, bitterest thing of all. Carloads of oranges dumped on the ground. The people came for miles to take the fruit, but this could not be. How would they buy oranges at 20 cents a dozen if they could drive out and pick them up? And men with hoses squirt kerosene on the oranges, and they are angry at the crime, angry at the people who have come to take the fruit. 1 million people hungry, needing the fruit, and kerosene sprayed all over the Golden Mountains. And the smell of rot fills the country. Burn coffee for fuel in the ships, burn corn to keep warm. It makes a hot fire. Dump potatoes in the rivers and place guards along the banks to keep the hungry people from fishing them out. Slaughter the pigs and bury them. and the putrescence drip down into the earth. There is a crime here that goes beyond denunciation. There is a sorrow here that weeping cannot symbolize. There is a failure here that topples all of our successes. The fertile earth, the straight tree rows, the sturdy trunks, and the ripe fruit. And children dying of pellagra must die because a profit cannot be taken from an orange. And coroners must fill in the certificate, died of malnutrition, because the food must rot, must be forced to rot. The people come with nets to fish for potatoes in the river, and the guards hold them back. They come in rattling cars to get the dumped oranges, but the kerosene is sprayed. And they stand still and watch the potatoes float by, listen to the screaming pigs being killed in a ditch and covered with quicklime, watch the mountains of oranges slope down to the putrefying ooze. And in the eyes of the people, there is the failure. In the eyes of the hungry, there is the growing wrath. In the souls of the people, the grapes of wrath are filling and growing heavy for the vintage.
Wow.
And it's a powerful expression, I would say,
Yeah.
of the intense feelings that that we see that we feel seeing these things every day.
Yeah.
It reminded me reading it of recently in Texas, where they had dumped out that food, and they had guards guarding the dumps so people wouldn't be able to come and collect it. It's beyond parody. It's beyond fictional dystopia. This is
Well, what about
this is life.
rural communities having to drink cola because Coca-Cola occupied their local water source?
Oh,
so,
yes.
so it's easier to get Coca-Cola than it is to get water.
Yeah, or the
Wow.
activities of Nestle in Africa,
Wow.
or any number of disgusting.
And that is due to colonialism. It's all one cause and effect from colonialism.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So are we seeing the effects? Yes, we're definitely seeing the effects every day all across the world. Continuously. And if you're on your white throne in the British Empire or the Dutch Empire, yeah, it's easy to put your blindfolds on and enjoy your steak on your golden throne. But it is putting your blindfolds on.
Yeah. And we can't go on like this.
Oh, clearly we can't. It's not sustainable. Gentlemen, so many more tangents I'd love to dive down on you with, but I love the idea of let's revisit. Let's do another episode in the near future.
I would love to.
Yeah, same. And looking forward to your video this month.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
It's a long one. Not as long as Beyond Binary podcast episode, but it's approaching an hour, so I think y'all would enjoy it.
Oh no, very much looking forward to it. And I know you said at the start you were nervous about doing the long form, but mate, do it more often. Like, you were brilliant. You handled this well, and the world needs more conversations like this.
Thanks.